Greetings and welcome. We are in Senior English A, and our objective now is to turn, having finished with our discussion of Chaucer, and we are going to now speak of what really is one of the most important story motifs, that means types, in all of British literature, King Arthur and the Arthurian motif, we will call it. That is to say, the stories that surround King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Some storytelling is in order. When we look at this story, the first thing we want to say is that it has multiple originations. In other words, it's not like one person sat down and wrote the story about King Arthur. These are multiple stories drawn from multiple sources. One of our key sources is a cat named Mallory, okay, who will tell about this famous warrior fighter. Okay? Now we're going to begin by just briefly summarizing the major high points of the story of King Arthur. In its most simplest form, you probably know it as the story of the sword in the stone. Or you know it as the story of the round table. Our goal here is to try to flesh out these different strands of story. Finishing with my lecture, talking about the significance of this story to English history. Strange women lying in ponds is no basis for a system of government. I'm quoting, of course, from the classic Monty Python's Holy Grail. When we take a look at John Cleese and his pals who make Monty Python's Holy Grail, it'll only be funny if we begin to understand the ways in which they take liberties with the story itself. Well, what is this story? It's a story that's interestingly politics. It's about politics. It's about government. It's about the way that people conquer other peoples and then enforce a certain understanding of government. Our story begins also with a wizard. His name is Merlin. Merlin will be for us one of those Tiresias characters you will maybe remember from the story of Homer's Odyssey. Tiresias, the blind prophet from Greek antiquity. He's blind, but he has the ability to see the past as well as the future. He can predict things. You'll maybe remember that Odysseus himself visits Tiresias in Hades, the underworld, where Tiresias tells him, when you go home, lots of bad things are going to happen. You're going to have nasty guys who are trying to kill you and to marry your wife, etc., etc. Merlin wields magic. And our story actually begins there. Jot down, what do you know of Merlin right now? Before any conversation about him, what do you know of Merlin? Okay, what do you know about this guy? Well, we called him a wizard, right? He has the ability to help, using magic, people get what they want. Our story begins with a great warrior. His name is Uther Pendragon. What makes Uther interesting is he acquires a very famous sword. Now, in the history of the world, sad to say maybe, but much of that history is about fighting wars, battles. And the weapons that are involved in that become then central to understanding the story, even today. In England, an individual is to be knighted, brought in front of a very particular group of people in a large cathedral called Westminster, in London, brought down in front of the Queen. She stands in front of him. He will kneel. She will draw a sword. Interesting. Not a machine gun. That's the weapon that we use, of course, in military combat. A sword. And that sword she will touch on both shoulders as well as on his head as she knights him. Now that sword is not the famed sword Excalibur that we're about to talk about. But I only mention it because for the English people, swords matter. They get names. We learned this in the Beowulf epic. You'll remember the famous sword hunting is mentioned. These swords have histories because they're kind of considered magic swords. They have a life of their own, if you will. Now, the sword we're talking about is the sword Excalibur. What is this sword? Well, it's a sword that is provided by the Lady of the Lake. Strange women lying in ponds is the reference from the Monty Python film. But a woman lying in a body of water will provide Merlin and Uther Pendragon with this sword. This sword will immediately allow him to begin to win battles. And ultimately, you will have the final battle. And Uther and who would fight it decide a ceasefire. Calm. Everything's going to be fine. Everything works well until Uther sees a woman. Now, this is always going to be a part of this story. Beautiful women mess up men's heads. And sure enough, this is what happens. Uther sees a beautiful woman. Just so happens to be the wife of the man that he just had the ceasefire with. He wants this woman, and so he uses Merlin's magic to change his shape to look like Igraine's husband. The agreement between Uther and Merlin is that whatever comes out of this union, Merlin gets it. What will come out of this union will be the child, Arthur. This is significant for your notes. Arthur is born a bastard. That is huge. He has dubious parentage. In other words, his mother and his father not married. In the process, Igraine's husband dies, leaving Uther and Igraine to be able to marry, and of course the child is born. When Merlin shows up, and Merlin says, you made a deal. It's kind of like making a deal with the devil. You made a deal. The deal is simply this. I want that kid. Igraine, of course, is like, whoa, what's going on? She then realizes that the man that she slept with was not, in fact, her husband, was, in fact, a man changed using magic. The child is taken by Merlin and taken away to be raised by Merlin and a family that he will give give Arthur to. Got me? In the meantime, Uther is attacked for Excalibur. And there's multiple variants of this story. But ultimately what happens is that the sword Excalibur ends up being driven into a rock, a large stone. Ergo, the sword in the stone. And the prophecy then is, whoever draws the sword from the stone will be king. Whoever draws the sword from the stone will be king. And for a long period of time, number of years, no one can draw the sword from the stone. Young Arthur grows up in a house of knights. Now let's talk about knights for a second. These knights follow the code of chivalry. Chivalry. Now what does that word mean? It basically means two things. Strength and honor. Strength, good fighters. These knights are great and mighty warriors. They wear armor, they ride on large horses, and they are involved in constant competition. Fighting all the time. Training, getting ready to compete. They love battles, they love fighting, they're great with weapons of any number of kinds, and they are tremendous horsemen. They can ride a horse and fight at the same time. They can, for example, carry a large lance and try and dehorse or knock off other guys on the horse. They do this training all the time. But it's not just about strength. There's the second one, honor. There is a code of honor. that runs something like this. First and foremost, a knight must take care of all women. He will never show a woman disrespect of any kind. If you grew up in a house where you were told guys don't hit girls, that was the code of chivalry. Your parents didn't make that rule up. That rule actually came from this time period where knights show women total respect. Okay? Number two, part of this honor code is a knight fights for his king and queen. He does not fight for himself. He's given a small amount of salary to live off of, but the knight does not fight for himself. He fights for his king or his queen. And if the king or queen says, let's go to fight, immediately do it, and pledging one's death. In other words, whatever it takes. Okay? So these knights have this honor code. Each of these knights in Arthur's time trying to draw this sword from the stone and become the king. Because at the moment, there is no king in the country. Arthur is raised in a house of a bunch of knights. His brother is hoping to be the next one to draw the sword from the stone. Problem. Arthur's job was to take care of his brother Kip's sword. He allows it to be stolen. And Arthur runs after the guy who's stealing it into the woods, and the guy gets away. When all of a sudden, Arthur turns around face to face with the stone that has Excalibur. Arthur knows nothing about Excalibur. Really, he doesn't understand much of it at all. The storylines come to us that Arthur's kind of a stupid kid. He's not really much into fighting. He's just there to help. He's what we call a squire. Well, he realizes that his brother needs a sword, and he realizes that the sword that his brother had got ripped off, and so he just walks up to the stone and just pulls the sword out, like no problem. And immediately everybody's like, dude, how did you just do that? Well, the reason he could do that is because he's Arthur. That is to say, his father was Uther Pendragon. His mother was Igraine. And immediately, there's this debate that happens. Is Arthur the young king? And he's just a young man. In the story, sometimes he's pictured as he's young as 12 or 13 years old. He's just a young boy when you see him for the first time in some of the stories. Arthur immediately is the subject, or the cause, I should say, of a civil war, fighting. You have two groups of people. One, those who side with Arthur and say, he drew the sword from the stone, he should be king. The other group that say things like, we will not have a bastard for a king. No way. This guy's got questionable parentage. There was magic involved, and Merlin is kind of crazy wizard guy. We're going to fight. We're going to fight against Arthur. Ultimately, and this is crucial now for your notes, Arthur becomes the great unifier. That is a significant moment in our story. Arthur, using Excalibur, brings all of the different warring tribes together, and in the process, three things he does that's very important, and these you definitely want in your notes. One, the first thing Arthur decides to do is to build a city. This city will be the greatest city of all of England, and he will call this city Camelot. That will be the name of the city. A beautiful city. A city that is planned from the very beginning to become the most beautiful, famous city of all time. It will be Arthur's city. He will live there. He will live there, number two, in a castle, and in the center of that castle, there will be a special room. And in the center of that room, there will be a special round table. Now, who comes up with this idea is the subject of much debate. Some strands of the story say it's Arthur. Some strands of the story say it's Merlin who makes this recommendation. Let's talk, though, about the importance of the round table as opposed to what? A square table, right? You're sitting now at a square table. Dude, what is up with a round table? Why is that such an important thing? Let's put it in our notes now. This is the first important moment of democracy. We'll use that term, won't we? Democracy. What do we mean when we use the term democracy? Equality. I don't understand. Why has the round table got anything to do with equality? Because there's no head of the table. You're absolutely right. No head of the table. When Arthur is sitting at the table with the other knights, they are all equal, including Arthur. Whoa. That's an important moment. Why would a guy who has the power of Excalibur, who could lop anybody's head off with it, why would he ever give equal voice to all of his knights? In that moment, his knights, we are told, are forever going to serve their king, King Arthur. They love him because they respect him. Why do they respect him? Because he believes in equality for all of his knights. So he builds Camelot. He builds a round table where there is this democratic understanding. If they're going to do something, they all kind of got to agree on it. Number 3, and important, he marries. His queen Guinevere, drop dead, Victoria's Secret model, gorgeous. She's totally into Arthur, and they get married. Hurrah! So, I mean, at this point in our story, let's just say it out loud. Arthur is having a great life, right? He's got a beautiful city named Camelot. He's got a democratic understanding of rule. All of his knights love him deeply because he's given them the freedom of equality. And he's got this drop-dead gorgeous woman who is his wife and hopefully will bear him a son so that the kingdom will be able to have an heir. Yay! Everything is going perfect. But enter part 2 of our story. Part 2 of our story is what we call the love triangle of our story. Now, if you'll remember, for those of you that watched Brad Pitt's film Troy, or you're familiar with the story of the Troy tale, you are familiar that the fight at the walls of Troy caused because, why? Well, the prince of the city of Troy is a Trojan. His name is Paris. You'll remember he goes to the land of Sparta, where he meets the drop-dead gorgeous Helen, and they decide to fall in love and hook up and become a thing. But the only problem is Helen's got a guy. He just happens to be the king of Sparta. And if you ever saw the film 300, you know what guys think in Sparta about their women. And so Paris takes Helen back to the walls of Troy, and that's why we have to have a fight where ultimately Troy will fall because of, you remember that Trojan horse thingy, remember all of that? Right. All of that happens because of a love triangle. Paris and Menelaus, 2 guys, and a girl, Helen. We're going to see the same kind of story recapitulated now in the Arthurian motif. Are you ready for this? Arthur befriends the best knight. His name is Lancelot. Lancelot is an amazing knight. He outfights all of the other knights. He's strong. He's a great and mighty fighter. Are you ready for this? He is drop-dead gorgeous. Women look at Lancelot and immediately want to be with Lancelot. His only response is, what can I say? That's his response. What can I say? He and Arthur become best pals. He becomes Arthur's greatest warrior. And then, right, Arthur not spending maybe as much time with Guinevere as he should. Guinevere and Lancelot have a thing. They have a thing. Yeah, they have a thing. And in the process, all kinds of terrible things will begin to happen to the kingdom. If you will, right at the moment when everything is going the best, Camelot begins to fragment, to fall apart. Arthur can't kill Lancelot. He can't kill Guinevere because he loves both of them. Lancelot's his best pal. Guinevere's his wife. What are you going to do? There's another interesting part of our story, though. And it has to do with Arthur's half-sister. When Arthur's father, Uther, slept with Igraine, Igraine already had a daughter. Her name, Morgana. Morgana is our witch of the Arthurian motif. Morgana grows up to be a witch, kind of a contemporary of Merlin's. She is not at all pleased that Merlin used magic to ostensibly allow for Arthur to be born and for her daddy to be killed. So Morgana has a desire to unseat Arthur. And the way she decides to do this is by using magic. She comes to Arthur in his bed and sleeps with him. Talk about your dysfunctional family. And sleeps with him because she has changed herself to look like Guinevere. We're back to the beginning of our story, right? Notice how in this story, it seems like irresponsible sex leads to all kinds of problems. Do you see that mentioned? It seems like a theme in this story, right? Okay, so here we go. Arthur sleeps with his half-sister, Morgana. And out of this union, Mordred is born. Now, Mordred is the bad guy of our story. He is Arthur's son, but he is a D-A-D bad guy. Morgana will use magic to raise him to be the greatest warrior. It's kind of the Achilles story of dipping Achilles down in the river Styx so that he has that special coating so he's protected. Very similar. Mordred grows up to be a powerful warrior, but more importantly, he is a man of tremendous hate. He is a true villain. If you've ever watched a film where the bad guy is just straight out bad guy, there's nothing redeeming about him. He'll kill anybody, he'll jack anybody, and he doesn't care about loyalties of any kind. That's Mordred. Ultimately, Mordred is going to come and march against Arthur. And in the final day of Arthur, and that's what Mallory will call it, you'll be reading about this, in the final day of Arthur, you will find there a famous story about this final meeting. Before I talk about, though, that, we have to inject one other element into the plot line that's very important. Arthur, after the birth of his son, Mordred, becomes sick. He begins to die. He is told the only way that he can be saved is if he drinks from the cup of Christ. Whoa, what is that all about? This is sometimes referred to as the Holy, H-O-L-Y, Grail. Grail means cup. Okay. Well, what's this all about? Well, in legend, there was this story that on the day Jesus Christ died on the cross, somebody held a cup right underneath him and blood dripped into the cup. This cup then became famous. If you drank from it, you would be restored back to life again. Arthur calls all of his knights together, sends them out on a famous search for this grail. Ultimately, it is found. The grail is found and brought back to King Arthur. He drinks from it and he is rejuvenated. The secret of the grail is simply this: as goes the king, so goes the state. That is a concept you want to write down. As goes the king, so goes the state. What does that mean? It means this simply. For the British people, if you have a good king, you will have a good and healthy state. If you have a bad king, you will have an unhealthy state. Now see, as Americans and as Democrats, we have a difficult time sometimes understanding this concept. For the English, you don't vote for your king. Your king comes to the throne one of two ways. Either he kills to get there in some way, insurrection, or he's the son of the earlier king, right? And that's normally how it works. So for the English, they had a story that basically said, the king has got to be a good man, or our country, bad news. See, think about how that's a little bit different from the way Americans think. Americans think if we have a president and the president doesn't do very well, you just can vote for a new one. It's not a big deal. But in the English mentality, not the way it works out at all. The myth of the Grail then, the lesson of the Grail is, the king and the land are one. As goes the king, so goes the state. Final day of Arthur. Arthur has bad dreams. And he's really not that excited to go up against his own son. What will he do? Arthur, in a terrible battle where most everybody dies, Lancelot even returns to help Arthur and himself dies in the final day of Arthur's life. Until finally, Arthur and his son come face to face. They're both pictured as just being covered in blood and guts. Arthur still having Excalibur in his hand, Mordred having this long spear in his hand. And they come towards each other, and Arthur's voice says to him, "Father, let us embrace," or hug. And then he stabs the spear into Arthur, goes through Arthur and out the back. But Arthur doesn't so easily die. He pulls himself down the spear, coming face to face with his son, and he uses Excalibur, and he kills his own boy. Again, talk about your dysfunctional family, right? Arthur, however, like Beowulf at the end of Beowulf's life, Arthur is dead. It's only a matter of time. What to do with Excalibur, the sword? He calls to him his servant, Bedivere, and he says to him, I want you to take the sword Excalibur down to the river, down to the water, to the lakeside, and I want you to throw it into the water in the lake. Just huck it in there. Nice and good throw. Go. Bedivere goes, comes back, and says, yeah, I did it. Arthur says, what happened? He said, nothing. Wind on the water. Arthur's like, what are you talking about? You didn't do it. And Bedivere goes, I can't throw the sword of kings into the water. Arthur says, do it and watch what happens. Bedivere goes, he tries, he can't do it, he comes back. One more time, Arthur says, third time, I'm telling you, throw it in and just watch what happens. And sure enough, he throws this sword out into the water. It never hits the water. A arm, comes out of the water, catches the sword, and then slowly draws it back in. It's the Lady of the Lake. It's the one who gave the sword originally. The argument runs something like this. Someday in the future, Excalibur will return and will allow for a new king to unite the people the way King Arthur united the people. Bedivere goes back to tell Arthur, whoa, awesome, this woman lying in that lake caught that, and he's gone. Arthur is gone. He is sailing away. He is dying. Bedivere creates a tombstone for Arthur. No body to bury, but they still have a tombstone. On the tombstone are the words, and they're important for your notes. King Arthur, the once and future king. King Arthur, the once and future king. And this is the way it goes, and this is why this storyline is so important to the British people. At any given point, when things start getting bad politically, the people can begin to hope for a new king who will come and do one really important thing: unify everyone, bring everyone together. And in that process, you can have political hope. So no matter how bad things get, the Arthurian motif allows for the British people to say, it's all going to be okay. We're going to get another Arthur-like king someday. He'll come back. This, by the way, is what we will often refer to as the messianic quality. A Messiah is one who returns to save. And saving the people of England becomes then always one of those things that's hoped for in the middle of bad times. Now, King Arthur and the motif of King Arthur, really important. Let's talk about why in the final points of my lecture here. 1, Arthur provides a certain sense of democratic idealism. He represents a good king who gives everybody a fair voice. This will become a powerful idea in the scientific enlightenment that will follow and produce a cat like Thomas Jefferson. We hold these truths to be self-evident. All men are created. What's our word? See how that works? Where does an idea like that come from? Some will argue the Arthurian motif is the first place that it begins, and that's why it's so important. Number 2, Arthur provides us with an understanding as well of the notion of political hope. No matter how bad it gets, there's always the chance that a new leader will arise that will in some way save us and lead us. Okay? Number 3, the Arthurian motif is a cautionary tale about pride. Remember what I said. Right about the time everything looks like it's going to be unbelievably great, Arthur's riding at the top of the wave. He's got Camelot. He's got the Round Table. He's got Guinevere. He's got his best friend Lancelot. There's nobody to fight and defeat him. It's right at that moment that what? The house of cards all comes down, huh? So this story becomes a cautionary tale about you better be careful. The moment you think you're all that, that's usually when something really bad happens. Finally, How has the Arthurian motif affected American thought? Let's finish with this. Americans have always been very interested in British politics. When, for example, the new Queen was there, this was a big dog deal, the marriage of the Queen of England and all of that stuff, the Princess Diana. Of course, Princess Diana's death was followed very closely in American media. It's a big deal. Americans have always been enamored of the British royalty. Even though in America we don't have a king, we have, of course, presidents, correct? But in American thought, several times, the Arthurian motif has found its way into a place of interest for Americans. Let me give you one classic example. The young president, John F. Kennedy, was a very private man and did not enjoy a lot of media around his family. But he did allow one time for the Life magazine photographers to come in and to video and to camera shoot his family. And you've maybe seen some of these very famous black and white pictures in his boat, throwing his football, playing with his children, beautiful wife, Jackie Kennedy, this family, this ideal family. It was after this spread in Life magazine that people began to talk about the Kennedy administration as Camelot. And in print, for the first time, the word Camelot started to be actually used with John F. Kennedy and Kennedy as a possible Arthurian type of figure. Well, now, if you'll think about it, what you know about John F. Kennedy, that makes some sense. Before he was assassinated, what were his primary agenda points? Remember, he was trying to bring together better race relations in America. Remember this? He was trying to offer the opportunity of every person in America of receiving a fair education, even people of color, even women. In other words, he was trying to become the great unifier. Right? Of course, JFK's assassination then would lead to a lot of tragedy in American thinking, right? In other words, if he could have lived, could he have brought it off? Could he have brought America closer together in terms of issues of race and the others? Right? And finally, it was an interesting moment for our current president, Barack Obama, to be elected to political office. What an amazing story, especially for the rest of the world. Here was a man who came from a black family. He was a black person, a man of color, and he was elected President of the United States. What an amazing story. And of course, right away, all kinds of people were writing in the newspapers about this new president. He was young, he had his beautiful wife, of course his children. He got on an airplane and he went to make his first trip in his first year as president to England. Before he arrived in England, the London Times had a headline that said, "The Return of Arthur," speaking about our President of the United States, referring to him as King Arthur. Now, I'm not talking with you about whether you like the President of the United States. We all respect the President of the United States by virtue of our understanding of what it means to be an American. But it is an interesting question. Why would British journalists refer to President Barack Obama as King Arthur? He never carried a sword in his life. There's no Excalibur to speak of. We're back to this motif again. There seems to be in politics a dream that is rooted in the Arthurian motif that says simply this: when everyone is fragmenting and falling apart, we all have a tendency to look for a leader that will arrive, that will somehow bring everybody together. There was, of course, great hope in England, as there was around the rest of the world, that somebody that, like Barack Obama, could maybe do that as a person of an interesting background in terms of being African American, in terms of being from a poor family, in terms of being from a single parent family, etc., etc. That ability would maybe be able to reach out and to speak to all peoples, to try to bring people together and therefore unify them. The Arthurian motif then for us is a very famous idea that continues to perpetuate in our politics, and we could say even in our culture. Of course, finally we could say in our movies. There are a lot of films that have been made about the Arthurian motif. One of the most famous of those films is a film called Excalibur. It was made in the late 80s. It's now a very old film. But it does seem to follow very well the major storylines. And if we have time, we'll have you watch this film as a way to kind of learn more about the King Arthur story. Of course, the other place we go is a satiric movie called Monty Python's Search for the Holy Grail, which kind of makes fun in many ways of lots of these storylines. Of course, it's only funny, really, if you kind of know more about the storyline. All right, now what are we going to do? We're going to look at two texts. Final comments. We're going to look at two texts. The first text will be King Arthur and the Green Knight. Now, this is going to tell a story that's kind of strange, but you're going to enjoy it. The second story is going to tell, it's Mallory's account of the final day of Arthur when he goes face to face against who? His son. And what happens to Arthur in the end? Like Beowulf, he dies. Yes, like Beowulf, he does die. Okay? So there we go. An introduction to King Arthur and the Arthurian motif. Thank you.